Good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody. Please stand for the academic procession. Please be seated.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Ingrid Willard, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Economic and Management Sciences. It's my enormous pleasure to welcome each and every one of you here to this very special occasion, Professor Dieter van Fintel's inaugural lecture. We're welcoming many guests online, particularly friends from far and wide of Dieter's that weren't able to be here in person, but it's also just fantastic to see so many people in the room. I think this really is one of the best attended inaugurals we've had post-COVID. So it's so good to actually have people not only online who wouldn't have been able to participate without this hybrid modality, but also to have so many people in the room. A special welcome to our COO, Professor Stan du Plessis, to our Vice Dean from the School of Accountancy, Professor Pieter van Villig, as well as to our Vice Dean, Ronaldo Priya-Snyman, who's joining us online, to Professor Ada Janssen, the Chair of the Department of Economics, and of course to the very many members of the faculty, and particularly the members of the Department of Economics that are here this evening. It's really great that you all came out to support your colleague. We also have in the room Marisa van Fintel, Dieter's wife, a member of the department. She's here with, she and Dieter's children, Wilhelm and Ben, are also joining us. We hope you have a lovely evening. And Dieter's mother, Helga, and Marisa's parents, Aubrey and Marianne. So a very, very warm welcome to you. These inaugural lectures are an occasion for the professor not just to profess to the rest of his colleagues and professional associates, but also to demonstrate knowledge to a broader audience of family and friends. And I always think that that's one of the most difficult things to do, is to both give a lecture that is engaging to one's colleagues, but that is also something that the family can be truly proud of. But I know that Dieter will do that this evening. So it's my great pleasure to do a short introduction for Professor Dieter van Fintel. He is a development economist and economic historian. His research focuses on uncovering the impacts of historical events and contemporary policies on agricultural, labor, food security, and health outcomes of households and firms in various parts of sub-Saharan Africa. He's an expert in applied microeconometrics, which I'm sure many of us in the department will attest to. He is our go-to guy whenever we have econometrics questions. But his major focus is on analyzing the differences in economic and human development using a variety of data, such as survey data, administrative, and most recently, satellite data. His work has a particular focus on inequalities between peoples and places, a topic that he will talk to us about tonight. So Dieter grew up in KZN. At the end of his schooling, he chose to come to Stellenbosch University without a clear plan as to exactly what he would study. But right from the very first day, he fell in love with economics, and we're very, very pleased that that is the discipline that found him. So after completing his master's in 2006, he joined the department as a lecturer, and he very quickly integrated into some teams in the department of both economic historians, colleagues such as Johan Fourie, as well as the development economics group led by Sir Fas van den Berg. So under the supervision of Sir Fas van den Berg and Rudolf Burger, he completed his PhD in 2014. His expertise in using microdata has led to further collaborations with scholars from a wide range of disciplines, including historians, geographers, psychologists, agriculturalists, health and nutrition experts. He also plays an active role in the community of economic historians and has built a fruitful collaboration, particularly with his colleague, Professor Johan Fourie. He's affiliated with ISA, the Institute for the Study of Labour in Bonn, the Global Labour Organization, and the Pan-African Scientific Research Council. His research has been recognized with multiple prizes, including the 2020 Montius Prize for the best paper in the Journal of Comparative Economics, and in the same year, the Best Paper Prize for his work in the economics of the history of developing regions. Both the Economic Society of South Africa and the Agricultural Economic Society of South Africa have recognized his applied empirical work with Best Paper Awards. He is rated as an established researcher with the National Research Foundation. He has consulted internationally to the World Food Programme, to UNICEF, national statistical agencies, and national government departments on a range of policy concerns and statistical issues. His work has been cited in presidential speeches and has been reported by leading international media outlets. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Dieter van Fintel.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Ingrid. So to the Dean, Professor Ingrid Willard, Vice Dean, Professor Pieter van Wielig, COO, Professor Stan du Plessis, the Head of the Department of Economics, Ada Janssen, the former Head of Department of Economics, Professor Angie Scumbi, family, colleagues, friends. I'm humbled to give you a glimpse into my academic work and also some of my personal perspectives. It's a challenge to do so because academics like myself sometimes live on an island with niche ideas that aren't accessible to everybody. But I hope everyone will take at least one new insight away from this evening's lecture. But academics also have collaborative journeys. I would like to thank my many co-authors at Stellenbosch and across the world for enriching my scholarly life of ideas, the immense support that I've enjoyed from past and present departmental chairs in my academic development, the inputs of support staff in the department and also the university more broadly, and the collegial working environment that I have undoubtedly enjoyed over many years in our department. I really trust that this will continue into the future. I would also like to thank my family for their continued commitment. You will see in today's lecture that for me the importance of family is not only something that happens after hours, but it is actually also part of my academic interest. In particular, I would like to thank my wife, Marisa, for her unwavering support for both my career and our joint task of raising our sons. It is quite special to go home in the evenings and somebody understands exactly what you're talking about. In fact, she critiqued this lecture, so it has her seal of approval. My lecture is entitled People, Place, and Development, because development is senseless if we do not prioritize human flourishing. Very often the environment or places where people are located have a strong bearing on whether individuals are enabled to flourish or not. Today I will tell stories using historical and contemporary data, piecing together a range of sometimes imperfect sources, but these empirical stories are as fact-based as possible. But as Yuval Harari recently wrote in The Economist, what would happen once a non-human intelligence becomes better than the average human at telling stories? Composing melodies, drawing images, and writing laws and scriptures. That's, to me, a horrific thought, right? We may lose our compass. But I posit that humans should continue telling stories and advancing true stories that are honorable, right, pure, and of good repute. Data stories can play a part in achieving this objective if we commit to integrity, credibility, and empirical rigor. I therefore argue that even as the world stands at the precipice of massive technological change and societal change, and as David Autor recently wrote, computers know more than they can tell us, we should continue in what we are good at: inquiry, creativity, and sense-making. This evening I will tell data stories which I actually hope may be refuted with new data and better methods in future. And actually also because the problems that they explore, I hope they get solved. And that they will become irrelevant problems to explore in the future. So my students, as Ingrid said, know me for a lot of econometric models. I promise I won't go there. I'm just going to show you pretty pictures today. Okay. So let's start. Where have we come from? On the top, I show you a picture of poverty rates. And these statistics show that we are currently located, you don't have to look at all the detail, but they show that we are currently located in the world region that now has the highest poverty rates of all regions in the world. A position that we didn't start with in the 1990s, but that we took over from the fast-growing Asian economies. Economic growth is undoubtedly one of the necessary engines to reduce poverty. In fact, economics students learn very, very early on about gross domestic product and poverty, dominant measurable metrics that can be used to track what we call development. They have become our high-level proxy for human flourishing, as imperfect as that is. Since the advent of World Bank Living Standards measurement surveys in the 1980s, it has become easier to draw graphs like this and to compare different places in the world. In fact, 2015 Nobel laureate Angus Deaton's book on the analysis of household surveys has set the tone for us and still sits on many of our dusty shelves, hopefully used more often than not. But we have to admit at least two major problems when talking about poverty and thinking about where people fit into our notion of what we call development. Firstly, as former World Bank chief economist Shanta Devajiran noted, Africa has a statistical tragedy. Or put differently by economic historian Morten Scherven, we have poor numbers. Are the data really good enough for us to track development? I will not explore these details here, but put that weakness on the table. Secondly, if we conceptualize what we call development, it is not only material. Nobel laureate Amartya Sen focused our attention on what he called capabilities, a myriad of factors that enable human flourishing, acknowledging that man shall not live by bread alone. We need health, education, a social compact, and I might add spiritual well-being to flourish. In fact, the fourth king of Bhutan declared in 1972 that gross national happiness is far more important than gross domestic product, and that is what they should pursue. You'll see the bottom of this slide looks at the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals to get us closer to this concept of the many dimensions of human flourishing. They quantify many capabilities like quality education, clean water, sanitation, peace and justice, and strong institutions, something which I hold very highly. So the Sustainable Development Goals see people and lives as a whole, not only by what they produce or by what they own. So what is it about people that matters to us? I asked DALL-E 3 to draw me this picture to summarize this lecture for me. And the first question you might ask is what on earth is this got to do with economics? Because this looks like a human life, it looks like human biology. In fact, I left biology very early in my school career, but I've somehow returned to it. But as the late Prof. Pieter Blanche reminded us, economics is called Volkshuishoudkunde, or national household economics. It encompasses every aspect and decision that we make, not just about economic life, but our lives in totality. So the outer circles of this represent adult outcomes. Are we capable enough to work? Are we capable enough to be in good health? But increasingly, the inner circles are becoming more and more important to us. They emphasize early life as foundational to later outcomes. The one economist, Jim Heckman, also a Nobel Prize winner, has helped to shift economists' attention from the outside circle, the outcomes, to the inner loop, though we have learned the importance from this from health experts and many others, with the words first 1,000 days, the period from conception to 2 years, now firmly part of our vocabulary, understanding the importance of this for setting the future tone. So both cognitive and non-cognitive skills have very, very early roots that have a bearing on many of these later life outcomes, including how wealthy we become as adults, and even our chances of staying out of prison. Okay? So my own research has gradually shifted from the outside of the circle into the inside, acknowledging that many of our broader socioeconomic challenges have deep roots in individuals' early lives and also through intergenerational transmission. The research on socioeconomic health and education groups focus strongly on these matters under the trusted leadership of our mentor, Professor Sfas van den Berg, who I'd like to acknowledge tonight. For instance, I've had the privilege to learn a lot about in utero care, imagine that, as an economist, and early life with Ronelle Berger and a team of PhD researchers, many of whom are here tonight, and I'd like to acknowledge you also. As one example, Martin Mwale, Anya Smith, and I have shown that in Malawi, a country that's very often studied, we need layers of protection to help children that solve sequential problems to produce a better whole in the end of the day. We look particularly at farm input subsidies in that country, which are intended to alleviate poverty and to improve the nutrition of households. However, we found that they don't improve child nutrition. And one of the reasons is that it only improves it for a certain group, the group of children whose mothers had good health care in utero. And that is a very, very important lesson for us to learn. What we need to learn is that what happens at other times in life influences about what happens today and into our future. We can try to fix today's problems with all sorts of policies, but over the long run, we will have to contend with addressing these very deeper problems that emerge at the very start of life. So I'll start with my own first 1,000 days. This is a picture that I trawled the internet for. I found it in a newspaper. And this was in 1981. South Africa had just come out of the unbanning of unions, non-racial unions in 1979. And in the year 1981, there were 300 strikes. My own hometown of Dalton, which you'll see in the corner, was at the center of this. You'll see here that these groups of workers walked 50 kilometers from the KwaZulu-Natal Midlands to Pietermaritzburg to assert their rights in a court of law. It kind of feels reminiscent of July 2021, where many workers and many other people asserted their rights and also showed their signal of socioeconomic distress in the province when the riots occurred in 2021. My late father and I always quipped that I was bound to become a labor economist because I was born so close to this strike and because it was so close to home. My environment was turbulent. I also recall hearing shots at night in the lead up to the 1994 first democratic elections when the Inkatha Freedom Party and the African National Congress were at loggerheads in KwaZulu-Natal. But the important thing is my home was stable as I enjoyed what we now know to be called the two-parent privilege, a term recently coined by Melissa Carney and which Johan recently blogged about. Children derive undoubted economic benefits from living with both their parents. But surely the value of that is so much greater than just an economic benefit. So there are intergenerational benefits. So let me talk about my ancestors. And this focuses on work which I've done with Johan Fourie and more recently Tiaan de Swart. I'm an 8th generation descendant of Ignatie Maree, incidentally an ancestor that we recently discovered with a very good friend of mine. He was a Huguenot who fled Europe following religious persecution of Protestants. This was a very specific group who continues to somehow stand out on some level in society. In the 18th century Cape Colony, winemaking was the biggest contributor to income inequality, and I'll show you in a second that income inequality was high in this society. And the Huguenots were good winemakers, okay? They both made more and better wine. So we used Cape Colony tax censuses, or as the opgaafrollen as they were called, which has subsequently spurred what could become a lifetime of potential work in the Cape of Good Hope panel project to show that the Huguenot wine productivity premium persisted across many generations, even after they integrated into Dutch society. While wealth transmission from fathers to sons was the most visible consequence of their agricultural success, we argue that it was the skills that were kept in the family that produced this distinction that lasted many generations. I'm not sure if I or many of my friends who share these ancestors inherited these skills. I'm quite sure I didn't. But I do believe that many of my ancestors' experiences informed both my value system and my career decisions. I think of the poverty under which my cotton German ancestors left Europe in the 1860s, the missionary school I attended in KwaZulu-Natal, and my Huguenot Protestant roots. I do not discount even this very long-run persistence into my own life. So are things persistent? If I show you this picture, I might convince you, yes, things are persistent. This graph graphs inequality all the way from 1700 to 2000, from estimates which I produced with Johan Fourie and Anna Orthofer, using vastly different time periods, but producing vastly similar results. By this result, we could say that things can be very persistent over the very, very long run. Inequality has barely shifted in the last 3 years. Now, this is a factor that I explore extensively with my colleagues in the Laboratory for the Economics of Africa's Past. And this is things that keep us awake. Does inequality last forever, and is simply South Africa's eternal fate? Is this what we should settle for? So the first thing that I would like to highlight from this is it's actually incredible that we have tax records from the 18th century, and also tax records. You might be surprised that it's incredible to have tax records from the 21st century, but this is a wonderful way for us to take forward. But inequality does not have to be persistent. In work with Calumet Links and Eric Green, we collate a large collection of historical inequality estimates across time and space to provide empirical support for Simon Kuznick's old hypothesis that inequalities can change as economies develop. And here I show you an example. The Netherlands, which just after 1800 had similarly high levels of inequality to the Cape Colony, has subsequently taken a very, very different path to become a low inequality country. So I will not go into the mechanisms behind that, but it does raise one of my core questions. What makes South Africa so specifically stubborn in its levels of inequality, even if it has developed into one of the most sophisticated economies on the African continent? And I'd like to suggest that we need good data to decipher these aspects. So data tells stories, but anybody who's worked with data knows there's lots of pitfalls. Okay? And the one thing is that data can tell selective stories. I show you some maps to illustrate this to you. Here are two maps that look very different from each other. The map on the left-hand side suggested that this part was depopulated after a mass migration and lots of conflict that started with Shaka Zulu. This map suggests the opposite. And as Norman Etherington suggests, South Africans have long been accustomed to wield maps as weapons in debates over land rights. On many occasions, the map proved mightier than the sword. So in this case, if we believe this empty land hypothesis, it justifies the fact that European colonization could just go unabated. If we believe this option, we believe that there should be restitution. So depending on the selective story we want to tell, it informs our narrative. Similarly, newly released Stats SA figures from the 2022 census, very hot off the press, suggests that if you compare 1996 to 2022, this is the proportion of households that are electrified. All is well in South Africa. South Africa does not have any energy poverty, and if we don't tell the full picture, you would believe me, and we would carry on to say, well, this is the truth, and we wouldn't believe that there's load shedding. I'm pleased to have been informed there's no load shedding tonight. But what this tells me is we need a broad evidence base. We don't just need evidence and data, we need broad-scale data literacy. And this is becoming salient to aid societies not just to adopt and go with good ideas steeped in reality and to avoid ill-conceived ideas. Data is not only useful to tell stories, but to decipher the narratives of the day, but also to verify the validity of the narratives of the day. So why is place important to economic development? So many presentations have begun with Johnny Miller's aerial photographs that vividly contrast the green affluence of Hout Bay with Mzamo Yetu. I again asked Dali, my AI friend, to emulate this message and be more extreme than Johnny Miller. Okay? And what Dali gave me was this very segregated city with very nice green leafy suburbs, very sparsely poorer left-hand side suburbs, and the core of the economy in the distance. Now, what does this mean? Well, the poor must travel far and at great cost in search of work and livelihoods. The way places are structured clearly obstruct how people can engage in economic activity, and if they can engage in the first place. But there's this notion in economics called the death of distance. It seems obvious. If you have the internet, everybody's working remotely, and we have the ability to travel long distances rapidly, place should be completely obsolete, right? It doesn't matter where we work or what we do, where our economy is located. But I contend that this is not true, certainly not in South Africa, because place was written into our laws for far too long. And let me show you this. These are the boundaries of the 1913 and 1936 Land Acts, which, as you can see, compared to the 1911 census data, were placed where initially there were very high concentrations of people. But what this did was limit ownership of African individuals to only be able to live in these, or to own land in these areas, and it effectively locked in some of these populations, only 13% of the country. Its neighbor is this picture which Adrian Frith drew and has become very famous, this is a map of Cape Town, and it uses the 2011 census. I wonder if the 2022 data will look different. I don't know yet. But we clearly see each of these dots represents a different population group. And you see very clear distinctions, almost like you can draw the boundaries through the suburbs. So the Group Areas Act of 1960 is still very, very visible. So essentially, I would say we are looking at people that have been locked down for decades into particular areas. But traditionally, South Africans have had itchy feet, and they don't like being locked down, as we have witnessed recently in the COVID pandemic. We like to move around. So before South Africa was densely settled, we saw many migrations. We saw migrations from the north, from East Africa. We saw even the Ku population migrating upwards to the north. And here we see the fur tracker routes. Incidentally, also one of my ancestors was a fur tracker, migrating from the Cape into the areas which would eventually become economically developed. We have always migrated, often for economic reasons. So living in a country of migrants means places are always interconnected. What happens here influences what happens elsewhere. If there were no hindrances to movement, we would predict that socioeconomic differences between places should disappear. This is because when things are bad in one place, people have the choice to move, if they do. They are pushed away from their local problems and pulled away to new opportunities. That's why people migrate. The places they leave aren't the burden to provide new services is much smaller, and the movement changes the fortunes of all places. But when historical restrictions are in place, this kind of movement is just not possible. So what does it look like today? This is a map drawn by my colleague Eldridge Moses, which showed in the 2011 census where did people move to and from. People move very big distances in South Africa. And this comes after the 1986 revocation of influx controls, which limited movement of people who lived in these former homeland areas, which I showed previously, to be able to move into urban areas. Suddenly, the floodgates opened up. What did this do particularly for women? And this is a map for women. 25 years after the abolition of influx controls, women didn't necessarily move to where the economy was good for them. They moved to where the economy was good for their networks, for other men, for people who created employment, which suggests that people also move for non-economic reasons. And this is perhaps one of the reasons why our economic spatial differences have not been resolved in South Africa. But also what's important is that this new flood to urban areas is also going to place particular pressure on services being provided in these urban areas into the future. Let's take a step back and look back into history. And I will take you a walk through some of these migrations which happened earlier, which Johan Fourie and I take into a big narrative which we called the Great Divergence in South Africa. If I show you these first maps from 3 different sources across 3 very long different periods of times, I hope I can convince you that populations were in the same places, concentrated in similar places all through history, but for different reasons in each of these periods. And that's what I need to talk you through. So the first factor that came about, and I mentioned it briefly before, was the Mfikane, which was centered in the Zulu kingdom and dispersed people all over the place. Where were they dispersed to? If you look at the former homelands, these are some of the most rugged areas in the country. And as Nathan Nunn and his colleagues have shown, that ruggedness is often a place of protection from conflict. They looked at it particularly from the perspective of the slave trade, but we hypothesize that this is true for particularly this type of conflict which we were looking at. But the added benefit was as these people migrated to areas with wonderful rainfalls and lush soils for growth. And there was actually, by all accounts, there was a very active agricultural sector which should, by all accounts, have turned into one of the heartlands of economic activity in South Africa. But it didn't. By 2011, these are still our highest areas of unemployment. They're still the areas with very low nightlight luminosity, which is what a satellite data proxy, which economists are increasingly being used for local economic development. And also what we see is people are voting with their feet, as economists say. They are the most likely to leave and go elsewhere. Which really shows us that in this big narrative, what has happened is that we should really be thinking about that history has locked in these populations initially into these impoverished areas, but the history has changed the course of economics for a very long time. And these great divergences haven't been resolved ever since. Similar patterns have also been observed in southern Rhodesia, or modern-day Zimbabwe, where the 1930 Land Apportionment Act has also categorized and reserved certain portions of land for certain people. There were European farmlands, which were extensive. There were native purchase areas where African individuals were allowed individual property rights, and also tribal trust lands, which were more similar to our homelands, with communal property rights. With Tawanda Chingotsa, we use historical satellite images to estimate the extent of croplands in these areas. And I was surprised when I saw this for the first time that we can go back to the 1970s and try and recover the economic activity where we had no data. So what this really illustrates also is that satellite data has unlocked economic analysis in places and times where the data are either non-existent or inaccessible. And this really helps us to address one of the problems I've suggested, Africa's statistical tragedy. What we find is that in native purchase areas, their property rights, their limited property rights, help them to be able to grow more crops and greener crops in the short run, particularly if they were located close to other key economic infrastructures like markets. So what this suggests to us is that both the history, but also these accesses to basic market activities are very important to also resolving some of these historical cleavages that have been introduced. We use similar data to look at the 2000 fast-track land reform program, which most people know about, which really changed the face of Zimbabwean agriculture. We find that it had an initial negative effect, even though we have no economic data. We find that it had a negative effect on how green the crops were, which we got from the satellite data. And this actually showed us that in dismantling these property rights, it also had this negative impact. So what it suggests to us is that historical laws both lay a foundation for some of these spatial differences, but also the process of how we dismantle them is important for ensuring that we achieve relatively stable outcomes. But let's go back to South Africa and back to our homelands. This is work which I did with Lopino in 2013, and it maps hunger rates. I think you would all agree that hunger reflects one of our basic human needs. It was a topic which was also closely interrogated during the NIDS cram period during the COVID pandemic. So this base shows up in initial spatial inequalities. In the traditional areas or the homelands, hunger rates of children were 10%. They were much lower in the other parts of the country. But puzzlingly, we saw this convergence over time, and I've updated this with newer statistics, this convergence has stayed. So we did this because we were curious, 100 years after the implementation of the 1913 Land Act, whether we could still pick up these food security differences. We showed that there were still these hunger gaps 100 years later, but what was it that caused these gaps to disappear, even up until 2022? Well, let me show you this in a map. In 2002, again, if we focus on these homeland areas, that's where hunger was. You can almost see it jump out to you in a map. But by 2014, it's these same homeland areas where that hunger has been resolved. If we look at what this is correlated with, it's correlated with social support, particularly the child support grants, which have been very, very important to alleviate those hunger gaps. Okay. In follow-up work, we wanted to understand this better. We took steps to show that grants increased the rates of smallholder farming, but which also went on to improve household diets in these homeland areas. But social protection is not as good at solving more stubborn inequalities. Here I show you the stunting prevalence, which is also related to nutrition. This is work that I've been doing with Grace Leach, a current doctoral student of mine. Stunting is when children are far too short relative to the World Health Organization age-specific standards. Why are we interested in stunting? It predicts cognitive skills and many future life outcomes, and as I will show in just a minute, it's very strongly correlated with economic development across countries and also within countries. Okay? So while being short is not a perfect deterministic factor for predicting whether individuals remain behind in life, just look at myself, it does stand proxy for many other disadvantages in society. So the deeper problem of stunting is clearly not resolved by the same location of those cash transfers. And we view this as a deeper problem than hunger. Here it is evidence if I show you the composition of how households look. And this is what I referred to as the privilege of two parents. If we look at the proportion of absent fathers, these are, and particularly the proportion of paternal orphans, these are also concentrated in these former apartheid homelands. And what this really points to is that family support is also important on top of social support, if not more important than social support. And I would posit that this is one of the binding factors in our economy at the moment, especially in child development. Here is, as promised, I show you this blue line, which suggests that on this axis, as economies get bigger, these stunting rates become lower. Okay, that's great, wonderful. But my problem is why is South Africa sitting here? We're a middle-income country, these yellow dots, and our stunting rates are high. We're above this blue line where we should be. Compare that to the red dots, which are Zimbabwe, a country with far less development, but similar stunting rates. And then we have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. What's going wrong? Is it just inequality that this high level of GDP is only going to richer kids and not to the poorer kids, and it's the poorer kids that are stunted? No. Brazil, an almost equally high, unequal country, sits on the blue line. So our question is why is this just another one of those things that inequality is stubbornly high in South Africa? What is it that's so strange about South Africa? Okay. So it has been documented quite pessimistically that the stunting rate hasn't shifted at all in the past 5 decades. And it would just tell us, as I said, inequality is forever. I could tell you stunting forever. Let's throw our hands in the air and give up. But let's show you a historical perspective to throw this on its head. Because yes, what we have here are heights relative to World Health Organization standards. And we see in this period that was analyzed, yes, things are static. But that is ignoring previously undocumented evidence to suggest that we actually had, since the end of the World War II, we had massive progress in child heights. This has actually been similarly documented for adult heights, for which the records have been easier to find. But we now have this evidence from peer-reviewed articles which we have dug up since the 1940s with the help of Stellenbosch Library. We're very grateful for that. This is part of a project with Eric Schneider and 40 co-authors, where this is just the South African leg of about 40 countries of data, where we're going to document these trends. So what this tells us, it does give us hope to suggest that stunting is not forever, and that inequalities are not forever. But we do need to understand what are the policies that have got us there, and how can we escape this particular ceiling. I've also ventured with Kate Rich into understanding obesity. Also maybe not the territory of economists, but it has become. I've discovered recently the journals called Economics and Human Biology. Never thought I would publish in biology journals. Okay. But we call this the double burden of malnutrition. Not where just children are too short, but many of the rest of the population also become obese. And here we see this upward trend. As populations become richer, they can afford more fast food, more supermarket food, and they become more likely to be obese, unless they are health conscious. We see this same trend in South Africa itself. This is this upward trend. As incomes of households increase, their predicted body mass index increases. Except, with one exception, if you had high socioeconomic status in childhood. What it does suggest to us is that moving into this high income can be reversed if you actually have intergenerational transmission of socioeconomic status. And this is a very novel result because we don't know of many countries that have gone through any transition, but studying subpopulations that are going through this transition can help us to understand what could happen in the future. It says to us that inequality is not forever and that our social problems are not forever. Let us move to other policies. In the 1955 Freedom Charter, the living wages were prioritized for workers and minimum wages, but minimum wages only became a national policy in 2019. Just this morning, Tracy Davis writes in the Financial Mail that wage gaps in South Africa reflect our empathy gap. She says that discussions around the revisions of the Companies Amendment Bill highlights the concerning notion that the lowest paid workers should be grateful for having a job at all. But before 2019, minimum wages were set only in specific sectors. The sector that was most affected by these wages, and when I say most affected, I mean disemployment, was the post-2003 implementation in the agricultural sector. And it's a sector which I have studied extensively with Lopinar, Marlies Peek, Sarah Ito, and Michael Kilumulume. In 2013, you might recall the mass unrest in the Western Cape, which started in Durance, and which was demanding a 150 Rand increase in the minimum wage. This eventually did result in a 50%, almost discrete increase in the minimum wage. This would ring alarm bells in neoclassical economists' head, because they would say this is going to cause mass unemployment in the agricultural sector. But what do we see? The minimum wages actually in most provinces were just below the minimum wage. So there was just no compliance with the law, okay? Or low compliance at least. So that the effects, while we did see where this map is more orange, in the immediate wake of that increase, where the map is more orange, there were greater employment losses. But by April 2014, this orange map has turned green and purple. And this data uses, it's the first time we can produce these maps. Again, I would like to emphasize the availability of new administrative records from the South African Revenue Service, which we're very thankful for. But what this does show us is that these policies often don't match our expectations. The question is how do we both secure employment but also ensure compliance with this legislation? And it's a conundrum because it's difficult to increase both wages and employment in a country with as stresses that we face. One of the other major policies is affirmative action. There's very little quantitative work in this domain. And this is particularly designed to address racial redress, but there isn't a lot of quantitative evidence on this just because it's so hard to find good data. And you'll see this stops in 2013 because beyond that we don't trust the data. So we've got new ideas. In early work, research on socioeconomic policies, widely cited working paper completed for the National Planning Commission, we showed that education quality differences between rich and poor schools place the limits on the types of jobs that young workers are able to enter. If you go to a good school, you can get a good job. If you go to a bad school, you can't get a good job. As a consequence, many of the reasons for some of these racial gaps in the workplace actually really start much earlier in the segregated school system, but perhaps also much earlier in life, as I suggested, much earlier. With Rudolf Berger and Rachel Jafta, we recently published this particular overview of the trends in the racial wage gap and correlate this with these red lines, which were important pieces of legislation to address exactly these gaps. And what we have found up to now is that for the average worker, the barometer hasn't changed at all. For whom has it changed? This is the elite workers. So it's changed at the top and narrowed the gaps. So the question is really, how do we get this policy to have broad-based impact to reduce economic discrimination? Now, what about the future? This is a map of my co-authors. I hope I didn't miss anybody. This is really to pay tribute to my co-authors. I think each of them are committed to Africa's economic development. My hope is that this particular network will grow, but also the network of others who are working on African development. But I would like to say this is hard. It's not that obvious. This is a network which I recently drew with Nick Fink, looking at research on agricultural development economics. And what we see here is this is who produces the research, and the biggest circles are the most influential researchers. And what we're seeing is that this is research on Africa. It's not being produced by people in Africa. And it's being produced by multilateral organizations and West and US institutions. So really, if distance really were to die, this should become easy. We should be able to integrate into these networks quite easily. It means we could find good data that could help us to answer more questions. But we need to basically break into these networks. But also what this is a call for, I'm calling for unlocking existing sources of data that can help us to do better work, but also to anticipate the many new sources that AI can unlock for us. I've mentioned administrative sources, and I think this is my call to anybody listening. Administrative sources are very valuable to researchers. Please help researchers to get them. I also want to just remind ourselves that satellites don't lie like humans can in survey data, okay? But they require specialist skills to use effectively. I just read an article just yesterday that generative AI is helping even non-specialists like economists to speed up this process. So I'm very, very excited about this. There's also private data, point-of-sale scanner data, device tracking, but often this data is commercially valuable and not available to researchers. So this is my call to come and partner with us also. What about crowdsourcing? One of the big sources that we've used in genealogical research is family search. It's literally people sitting and tracing their grandmothers and great-grandfathers. Or, as also I did with Tawanda Chingotsa, we put some students on to classify what pocket of land is this. Is this a house? Or is it a building? But back to intergenerational, and this is for my kids who have joined me this evening. My children will be confronted with many challenges I don't have to face. I acknowledge that. I would like to focus on the battle for ideas as just one of them. I was exposed to apartheid-era television. I don't know what that did to me, if it still has an effect on me, but it was probably censored, I guess. Compare that to current-day information, which is abundant, perhaps less censored, and certainly less filtered. I don't know if that's a good thing either. How much of the masses of information that we have is actually valuable and usable? So my children are also exposed to subtle ideas in the media, and this was from a bedtime story the other night, where this extract came from. I'm not going to read it all to you. But essentially, there's a very politically loaded statement here that censuses are useless, and they're just there to extract money from the populace. But Similarly, in Paw Patrol, I'm sure many of you don't know that. I do. We have the good mayor, Mayor Goodway, and the bad mayor, the monopoly mayor, the capitalist mayor, right, dressed as a capitalist. And his name is Mayor Humdinger. And he lives in Foggy Bottom, which is incidentally the seat of power in Washington, D.C. So clearly a very anti-capitalist sentiment. We've got it all. And I wonder what my kids are going to have to navigate. So again, I emphasize data literacy. So many people ask for me, what is the one solution to South Africa's socioeconomic woes? I'm convinced that we don't have a magic bullet or one macro solution. We must continue to experiment with many complementary macro and micro solutions and set up layers of protection. We need to acknowledge that there is a lot we don't know and that our systems, as we see in these two quotes, are terribly imperfect to solve humanity's pressing problems. Even if we made substantial progress at reducing poverty in the last 30 years, our systems fail and ideology cannot cure us of our humanity, or is it our inhumanity? My hope is for a world less polarized, more fact-based, and more human. As J.K. Galbraith said, capitalism exploits man, man exploits man. Under socialism, man exploits man. Okay, systems are not immune to being exploited. But also, as Catholic author Michael Novak suggests, well, maybe the best we have is capitalism and democracy, but even that is not perfect. Can AI help us to pursue perfection, our new wonder child? Will it compensate for our fallibility and our fallible systems? And can it invent a system better than one we could? Because we know what AI does is it pieces together everything that we didn't think we know. Will it be able to sift through the best pieces and weave together a new future for us? I know some people think that. Or are our collective flaws just a ceiling on what we can be done? I don't think past experience supports that AI can solve our macro problems. Even if it has genius in solving micro problems, I believe AI will solve many, many smaller problems which we need to put together. As David Altuer has moved from optimism about technology and AI, I'm together with him, sitting him with a bit more caution as we look into the future. I know many others do not share my caution, but I am by nature a cautious person. I would just like to close it with this. I don't know if any of my musician friends recognize this. This is how J.S. Bach signed off every single one of his compositions. You might mistake it for saying that it stands for the Sustainable Development Goals. It doesn't. It stands for Soli Deo Gloria, before it became widely adopted as the Sustainable Development Goals. I, as he, close off with this, not only in support of the Sustainable Development Goals, but also just to remind ourselves that we as humans need help in getting better systems, in achieving these goals. We cannot do it with our own innovation, with our own intellect. We can get a long way, but we actually need a lot more help. I thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I suspect that, like me, you didn't want it to end. In fact, I was guessing what the source of the next piece of surprising data was that Dieter was going to take out of his box this evening. And he reminded me, as he spoke, of a great Austrian economist who, amongst his many achievements, wrote the opening article in the first journal for econometrics. Now, much of what Dieter showed us here this evening is loosely classified as econometrics. And here's what he said. We do not impose any credo, scientific or otherwise, and we have no common credo beyond holding, first, that economics is a science, and secondly, that this science has one very important quantitative aspect. He says, in one sense, economics is the most quantitative, not only of all social and moral sciences, but of all sciences, physics, not excluded. Some of the most fundamental economic facts, on the contrary, already present themselves to our observation as quantities made numerical by life itself. They carry meaning only by virtue of their numerical character. He goes on, we might even go so far as to say that by virtue of this, every economist is an econometrician, whether he wants to be or not. Now, some of us may be reluctant econometricians, but this evening we saw a master at work, and what a privilege it was. Professor von Fintel, congratulations, not only with an extraordinary lecture, but with the extraordinary body of work that you have produced that lies behind this lecture. And so allow me to remind you of some of the highlights of what we saw this evening. We started with the idea of economic development, which is, it's not, in fact, it is not just a quantitative idea, and I'm going to say something about that in a moment, because it is in the first instance a qualitative idea. It is the idea of living different lives over generations, more so than the idea of having more stuff. And the graphs and many demonstrations of persistence that we saw on the or in the various exhibitions this evening are actually synonyms for underdevelopment. So development is non-persistent in the qualitative aspect. But we started off with some really interesting data from the 18th century, and they are the kind of ideas that you see from economists, right? They're production data. You expect to see those. Later on, we saw real wage data. You expect to see those from economists. Then we had tax data. And of course, we saw that from the census. Even children realize that the tax data arrive eventually. And then we saw maps. So now we are starting to explore areas in which economists are not so comfortable, and actually where we fail to learn that there is rich data with an economic aspect locked up in maps and in fact various forms of maps. So some of those maps are traditional maps, but some of those maps are pictures taken by satellites from the air. And some of those satellites have long since crashed, but somehow Dieter discovered that the record of those photographs still exists, and you can look back into the 1970s as it looked from the air. And that turns out to be a much more accurate way of gauging the stage of economic activity in those societies than we could at that time. And of course, we have no option of now going back with better surveys. The map that struck me the most, though, before I move on from maps, is the map of Dieter's collaborators. Because for a young scholar to have a map of such an extensive gallery of co-authors also tells you something about the qualitative aspects of the career that we have seen already at a young stage from Professor von Fintel. So those co-authors are his colleagues here, they are colleagues all over the world, and they are especially his students. You would have seen how many of the papers was collaborative work with his students. So he has not just generated immensely interesting information and instructive information and policy-relevant information, which is cited even by ministers, about our economy, but he has taught a new generation of students also how to use these techniques. And really that is a tremendous achievement at a young age, and we honor you for it. So after satellite data, we saw network data, and I am actually more encouraged than you are. Stellenbosch was at least a non-trivial dot there, and it can be bigger. It can be bigger, and the reason it becomes bigger is because of the work that we saw here this evening, and for that we can be very optimistic. And then we had a really interesting biological data. So we had child height, we had stunting, we had a wealth of biological data which connected us to that early picture that we saw, that somehow the later, one might almost say, social and economic outcomes is connected to the first 1,000 days, a term I hadn't heard previously. So as you can see, the audience must now stop me because you get a very bad second version of the lecture. I say this by way of sharing my excitement with the lecture that we saw this evening, and that is what an inaugural lecture is meant to do. It is meant to show non-specialists something of the interesting and exciting work that the scholar does, and also to give us a foretaste of the work that the scholar is going to do. Secondly, it tells us something about the attitude of the scholar within the scholarly community, and really that could not have been better summarized than that gallery of co-authors that we have seen. And then my final task is to then ask our new member of Senate in the university also to take a leadership position within the scholarly community, and we look forward to it very much. Dieter, congratulations.
Very hard act to follow, both two brilliant speakers, but thank you very much for a brilliant lecture, Dieter. So to all the distinguished guests, our esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, the present and online, it is with my great pleasure and a deep sense of gratitude to Dieter that I stand here to thank you for a brilliant inaugural lecture. So firstly, I would just like to say, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to Dieter for delivering an enlightening and thought-provoking lecture. Your expertise, your passion, and commitment to advancing knowledge have set the tone for the academic journey ahead. I've known Dieter since he commenced his academic career in the Department of Economics, and he has always impressed me with his dedication to the discipline, his sincere devotion to our students, and to our department. And he's an excellent scholar, he's an excellent lecturer, and he's a friendly and a supportive colleague. So I thank you for that, Dieter. I would like to also acknowledge the presence of our distinguished guest, Dieter's family, his colleagues, students, and friends. Your support and participation have added prestige to this event, and we are honored to have you with us today. Your attentive presence contributed to this vibrant intellectual atmosphere that defines our academic community. So a special note of gratitude also goes to the entire team involved in organizing this event. The meticulous planning and attention to detail have made this inaugural lecture a seamless and memorable experience for all of us. So finally, as we embark on this academic journey, let us carry forward the inspiration that Dieter has offered us and the knowledge that we'll take from this inaugural lecture, and may it ignite further, and very passionate research for Dieter to come. So I invite you all to join Dieter and his family and all the colleagues and friends to celebrate this wonderful evening with Dieter. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please stand as the procession will leave the room now. Thank you and enjoy the refreshments.